So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Does that work?
Are you seeing
wonderful. So I wanted to give folks just a quick overview of DRUM, which is the Diverse and Revolutionary UU Multicultural Ministries. It was founded in the late 1990s, around the same time as on the journey towards wholeness. Mateo, can folks hear me? I'm sorry, before I jump in.
Yeah, I think you're all right, but you've been a little choppy at the moment, so hopefully it'll catch up with us here.
I'm going to turn off my video just for a little bit to help with my connection. My apologies, folks. So DRUM evolved most specifically from leadership in the African American UU Multicultural Ministries, which was a group that was around for about 15 years in the 80s and 90s. And they began to expand their circles to engage other folks of color and ultimately help to create the organization of DRUM, which started as a religious professionals of color organization and then slowly became a larger community organization for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The DRUM has been volunteer-led and has had no staff, no main office for its entire existence. I was brought on about a year ago as a very part-time consulting minister to help create more content and resources and programs for folks, particularly at the local level. For about a decade, DRUM served as the primary accountability partner with the UUA during the early years of the Journey Towards Wholeness process. However, since that process has devolved, particularly around 2010, DRUM has had a much different and more limited relationship with the UUA. And as has been mentioned here in the group, we have a sibling organization, the Allies for Racial Equity, which was formed as a white allies group and a space for folks who are working on anti-racism. So next slide, please. So the goals just of my presentation today are to center BIPOC UU stories and milestones that are often known by our elders and are sometimes passed down through the generations orally. And we've begun to try and collect more of these to help better expand our imagination of who and what Unitarian Universalism can be, and to also decolonize our imagination, because I think sometimes we can get stuck into a particular worldview that is dominated by whiteness in America. We also want to be able to honor and draw wisdom from the experiences of those who have come before us. We have some sayings in DRUM, we drink from wells that we did not dig, and we stand on the shoulders of ancestors. And I also think that there's a goal around sharing stories and histories and herstories to help ground Black, Indigenous UUs in a larger community and give folks a deeper sense of place and purpose. Next slide. Before I jump into sort of walking through some of the history, and I have a number of slides that we're going to run through, and some of them are going to go sort of faster, and some of them we'll try and slow down on. But it's just some of the sort of notes, assumptions, and analysis. One is that, and I think it's already been shared a bit in the check-in, folks who are folks of color in our UU churches experience a lot of isolation, particularly in America and in Canada. That people feel lonely, or they feel, like they might be the only one. And that, I think, has, that impacts people's ability for healthy faith formation. Folks of color in our churches also experience what we call the pet threat dynamic, which is, often they come in and they're identified as a person of color, and they're seen as exceptional, and they're sort of lifted up and put on a pedestal often quite quickly, until potentially there's some kind of conflict, or there's a racist experience, or a microaggression, and then suddenly the BIPOC UUs can be seen as a threat, or when they connect with one another. One of our ministers of color once said, to be a UU of color is to have to prepare to take the elevator to hell, which is that you're seen as someone who is, a key and prophetic leader 1 minute, and then the next minute, you've been shunned and you've been sort of sidelined from the church. And that is a really deep tension, I think, that a lot of folks of color feel, and we'll see some of that in our history. As UUs, we're one of the only faiths in America that has a missing legacy of culturally specific ministries. What that means is we have had opportunities to create a Black church, or a Latino church, or an Asian church, or even a more intentionally multicultural church in our denomination. And sometimes these have been rejected by the UUA or by local congregations. They have been shunned. They have also died because of a lack of support and relationship from the larger association. So we're one of the only faiths in America that does not have any history of a culturally specific ministry. When it comes to matters of race, I think in general, UUs are very well educated, if not one of the best educated faiths in America. However, when it comes to matters of race and racism, we tend to be very ahistorical and forgetful, and have not a deep sense of the history that has come before us. And so one of our, I think, efforts here with Drum is to share more of these stories so we can really address them and move on. And then lastly, we're one of the only faith denominations that does not conduct a racial ethnic demographic census. So we never really quite know what the racial cultural diversity of our denomination is. I think, as Sophia mentioned in her wonderful talk last time, it is problematic to always say that we are predominantly white. And I think there are realities around who we are that we still don't really know, and that we sometimes refuse to ask, maybe because we're fearful that it's going to just reinforce that overwhelmingly white dynamic. So I actually do believe that there are benefits in doing a census from time to time, so we know more about our communities, not just racially, culturally, but on other levels, because we count what matters. And I think in a world with racism, race does matter. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. We are all made of stories in the end. The weaving of our stories of love and struggle help define who we are. Whoever we are, we also have a relationship with larger cultural narratives that give our lives meaning and our values clarity. And we wrote this as we were presenting the timeline for the first time last year with religious professionals of color, the Reverend Kiama Rockman and the Reverend Marta Valentin and I. And just, I think this really speaks to why we're trying to surface more of the stories to help ground and give ourselves a sense of purpose. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to run through about 40 to 50 slides and primarily give folks the highlights. And then really this is something that we normally do as a gallery walk, where we'll put it up in a congregation and have the workshop folks sort of walk around and look at it. So I apologize that it's going to be maybe a little bit faster for folks. So take in what you can visually, and I'll give some of it voice as well. And if you have questions, and particularly be thinking about what are the themes that you see coming up. Maybe where does your journey start in terms of the timeline? These are, this is one way to put our UU faith in a deeper context. And if you have questions, feel free and put them in the chat as well. So let's go to the first slide. So while drum started in the 90s, and we started this timeline originally in the 90s, we kept moving back because it was really clear that like the context for drum and for people of color organizing today in the church has its roots in earlier generations. We could probably go back even further. And I also do want to note that this timeline is imperfect. It's a living timeline. These are just some selected moments in history to give folks a bit more perspective. But I wanted to start with 1966, which is when Dr. Martin Luther King was the guest speaker at our UUA's General Assembly. And his message to the gathered was, don't sleep through the revolution. And it was really the beginning of his analysis of challenging white liberals to be more engaged on the matters of racism in America. Because at the time, there was a deep division. A majority of white folks and a majority of UUs were still either oppositional or apathetic towards the civil rights movement that had started in the 50s. So here, Dr. King, someone who I think we often venerate in our UU churches, was challenging the UUs and the sort of silent majority of white liberals who have been on the sidelines for many, many years. Next slide. So the 60s saw a lot of organizing happen around civil rights, but it also was happening within the UU worlds. And the Black Affairs Caucus had formed. It was a Black caucus of Black Unitarian Universalists. And there was a real power struggle that happened. Promises were made, promises were broken. And in 1969, nearly 100 Black delegates and 300 white delegates walked out of the UUA's General Assembly. And as far as I can tell, based on the records, we've never had that many Black UUs attend GA ever again. We've had maybe 50 to 75, but we've never had 100 Black delegates at a UUA General Assembly. There was a story out of Los Angeles that they sent 40 Black delegates from the LA congregations to GA one year. Pretty incredible, and something that we don't really see today. There's a lot of sort of stories and reports and books written about this era. So if this is new to you, I think it's something really worth knowing more about the white power / Black empowerment controversy and the walkout in '69. Next slide. So as a result of, I think, all the agitation and all the struggle in the 60s and the internal conflicts in the UU worlds, matters of race and racism really went underground in our church. When the walkout happened and hundreds of Black folks left the church really in protest, and many have never come back, the larger white denominations' response and many of our congregations' response was to just ignore race again and to not speak about it, not listen to it, not talk about it, not do anything about it, at least not in a formal, organized way that was beyond maybe local initiatives. So racial justice really went underground. And if you look at the records, there's a lot of coded language. There's things around like urban ministry or inner city ministry. So it was really seen as like an urban problem. And not something that maybe affected many of our congregations, which in the 60s and 70s were a part of white flight from cities. I don't know the exact numbers, but for sure dozens, if not hundreds of our churches around the countries moved out of the cities and into the suburbs, partly as a result of a lot of the unrest happening. But some congregations stayed, and they began to form networks, including an urban church network that was a space where matters of race and racism were still trying to be addressed. Next slide. So Dr. William Jones is sort of a fairly famous UU theologian and was the founder of the Black Studies Department at Florida State University. And he published a book in '73 called Is God a White Racist? Which was really part of this discussion of Black theology and came at it from a Black humanist perspective. And so, I think, you can see already in our history, we've had BIPOC folks really contributing to these larger discussions of race and racism and seeking to also create community and studies around, who are our people, what is our legacy, what is our history, and not just accepting the status quo of sort of what the social and the historians have offered and provided. And Dr. Jones, his work really has continued. There's a strong sort of Black humanist network that is also somewhat connected to Black Lives of UU now, which is really exciting. So for folks who have been connected to Blue, you may have heard folks like Anthony Pinn speak, who's one of the proteges of Dr. William Jones. Next slide. So I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit just because time is short, but this is a slide referring to sort of the network of urban churches that formed called the City Center Church Advisory Committee. And you'll see many iterations of different networks and committees form over the next 20 years. Often they would last for a few years, maybe a decade, and then they would have to sort of be reorganized. So I think part of that is the way racism operates in our churches, is that they're always sort of reorganizing racial justice efforts, which often keeps us having to reset, and it makes it hard to build momentum and to create more meaningful change. Next slide. In 1980, I think in part because there were still so many complaints, especially now at the UUA staff level, about racism within the UUA, the board conducted a very substantial institutional racism audit and looked sort of top to bottom, interviewed all the staff, looked at it from primarily a human resources perspective, but also began to talk to their district staff. So they had about 30 or 40 folks who worked with congregations around the country. And it really found a lot of internal sort of policies and procedures and practices and behaviors that were contributing to a climate of sort of racist racist behaviors and actions, and a culture of fear within the association. Many recommendations were made, promises were made to implement them, but few, if any, were ever adopted. And the audit actually began to collect dust and was not really talked about again until the 1990s. Next slide. So in '82, a new network of Black UUs was formed called the Network, and it really tried to, again, formally affiliate itself with the UUA, and was the first group to be organized since the 1960s. And again, often led by many of our Black religious professionals and ministers. Next slide. And out of, I think, some of the organizing that came from folks of color, particularly Black folks coming together, there were demands made of the UUA to continue to work on matters of race and racism. And one of the sort of visions in the mid-'80s was to create more racial and ethnic sort of intentional congregations. And in 1984, they began to invest in some of these new starts around the country, including Atlanta, Durham, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Seattle. Next slide. So here are two sort of small examples of culturally specific ministries. The first is a Korean fellowship was founded at the first UU church in Los Angeles. There was a lot of Korean migration coming to the LA area, partly as a result of the dictatorship in South Korea. And the minister there was able to connect with some local leaders in the Korean community. And they ended up also hiring one of our first Asian American ministers, the Reverend Shin Kim, who is a bilingual Korean English speaking pastor, who actually became full fellowship with the UUA in 1980, in the 1980s. The group lasted for about 4 or 5 years, and then it ended up dissolving. But there was a real effort to bring that multilingual ministry into the church. And so if you ever go to the First Church Los Angeles, it's a beautiful old building, seats maybe 500. They had built in headsets into many of the pews, and they had a interpreter booth up in the balcony where they had both Korean and Spanish simultaneous interpretation on Sundays. Next slide. So also in the congregation, there were a number of mostly political refugees coming from Central America, in particular El Salvador. And they also began to connect with the churches in LA. One of the first undocumented families to ever seek sanctuary in a church were the Zaladas. Ricardo Zalada was he was basically like a congressperson who was elected in El Salvador before the dictatorship and the US sort of backed overthrow of the government happened. And so he and his family fled to the LA area, and they took sanctuary at First Church LA. And he and his family and many of their sort of friends and community joined into the church to form the Oscar Romero congregation within the UU Church of LA. And that lasted for almost 15 years in the LA area. And when I interviewed him, I interviewed Ricardo maybe like a year or two ago. He also shared how they ended up staying in multiple churches over the course of a year, in part to sort of keep one step ahead of INS or ICE today, the immigration officials who are trying to basically capture them and deport them. So it's interesting to sort of see how an alliance of UU churches worked together to protect this family. Next slide. So in '85, the Black Concerns Working Group was formed, and this was really, again, one of the efforts to really start to provide some workshops on racism for congregations to be able to address racial justice and to create more of a language and to have sort of a new start around anti-racism. What was interesting, though, is that one of the members of the group, the Reverend Mel Hoover, said, "We were given the charge of ending racism in the UUA and a budget of $5,000. So what we did was we went out to dinner." Next slide. '88 was when the African American UU Ministries forms, called AUM. And it had maybe 15 to 20 members, both seminarians and ministers primarily. And they would meet once or twice a year. The network, which I mentioned earlier, continued to be a place for Black lay folks. And they had one joint meeting together in Philadelphia that had maybe 150 folks gather. And that was sort of the height of these organizing efforts. Next slide. The Reverend Mark Morrison Reed, who was a longtime pastor, grew up in Chicago, served in Toronto for many, many years. He published a curriculum called How Open the Door, really looking at some of the stories and some of the barriers faced by African American folks in Unitarian Universalism. And he's continued to write, and you probably have seen him publish in the UU world and other places. He's really one of our incredible sort of historians of folks of color in the church. Next slide. So some other groups began to form in the 90s. This is the UU Network on Indigenous Affairs, and I'm going to keep going through the slides again, so next slide. Mateo, next slide again. In 92 is when the UUA adopted an action of immediate witness on racial and cultural diversity. And this really began to lay the groundwork for the journey towards wholeness. Next slide. This is the Congress of Black UUs I mentioned that met in Philadelphia. And I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. The UUA began to build a relationship with Crossroads Ministry, which was an interfaith ministry that was developing faith-based anti-racism training, and really began to think at a more systemic level and a more long-term level around what would it take to transform our association to move from being sort of a tacitly sort of racist institution to more of an explicitly anti-racist institution. Next slide. This is another sort of one of those big controversies at the General Assembly in 1993 in Charlotte, North Carolina. Despite protests from Black and folks of color who were sort of aghast at the plan, the organizers of GA hosted a Thomas Jefferson ball and said, "Come dressed in the period, dress of Thomas Jefferson." And, Black folks, before this even happened, raised, alarm, like, what are we supposed to come in chains and ball? And, the ball still went forward. It was in the program, and, there was a protest. There was, a group of folks of color who gathered and, basically was like, this is wrong, and made signs and really sort of raised their alarm. So here we are at our, National Assembly, our Continental Assembly, and even despite, being warned, folks still pushed ahead with this kind of experience. And I can speak to this personally because this was the first GA I attended as a youth, and it was quite an intense experience to sort of have to think through what it would mean to come sort of dressed in a period, costume essentially during an era when, we had such legalized slavery and racism. Next slide. Just a note of one of our other sort of early drum leaders, the Dr. James Brown, who was one of our sort of district executives or regional leads in the Southwest area based in Texas. And he really helped us get our organization started, and he passed away a few years ago. Next slide. So now we're getting to sort of when drum is beginning to form. The Jubilee trainings began to roll out across the country. They hosted 30 or 40 per year in congregations. These were weekend workshops on anti-racism called Creating a Jubilee World. And many of the trainers were some of the early organizers of drum as well. And they would always have these training teams of white and people of color trainers working together. Next slide. In 1995, a Latina UU group was formed that lasted for about 5 years, and brought together both lay and professionals of Latinx descent. Next slide. So in 97 was when the UUA adopted its sort of most sort of significant anti-racism resolution called the Journey Towards Wholeness, which really sort of named the sort of racist history and really put into more sort of focus the effort to create institutional change, to look at the systems and the power and the way those things move through our association. And this is Dr. Leon Spencer, who was one of the co-chairs of the Racial Cultural Diversity Task Force, who really led the way on the Journey Towards Wholeness. He was a longtime UUA Board of Trustee member as well. Next slide. So, sort of as a result of the Journey Towards Wholeness, the African American UU Multicultural Ministries began to meet with and connect with other professionals of color. And they had a meeting in Los Gatos, California in 1998, and that is when DRUM was officially founded. So next slide. You're not done with it? So about 30 folks had come together, from folks from the Latino groups, the African American groups, and then some individuals of Asian and Indigenous descent and Middle Eastern descent. And they were almost all ministers who initially started DRUM. And they, began to create some infrastructure, but then within a couple of years, they began to expand the membership to include all professionals of color, and then ultimately to include all lay folks of color. Next slide. DRUM affiliated with the UUA, and for about 10 years had a formal sort of partnership with the UUA, which saw DRUM as an accountability group of folks of color, organized folks of color who they could check in with and develop programs with and think about the progress towards moving towards an anti-racist association. So I'm just gonna do a quick time check, and I know that I may have already gone over. I've got maybe 10 more slides, and I'll try and move through them, and hopefully folks can maybe stay a few minutes longer, and I look forward to the BIPOC caucus discussion after as well. So next slide. So DRUM, in partnership with the UUA, began to create a range of activities, including youth and young adults of color programs, multiracial and families of color retreats, kept building out sort of anti-racism programs, organized leadership development camps in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And one of the first sort of formal programs for young adults and youth of color at General Assembly happened in 1998. And I just note that, again, many of the organizers are coming from our professionals of color ranks. So folks who are bringing a lot of wisdom and experience from their training, as well as, having a prophetic vision for having a more inclusive association. Next slide, please. So this is about the multiracial family camps, and we had maybe a dozen of them happen around the country from 98 to 2001, or 2003, excuse me. Next slide. So this is when DRUM expanded to include professionals of color, and a DRE, Rivette Diaz, was elected as our second president. And then next slide. And I'll just note that during this time of organizing, there were a lot of complaints that were coming in from congregations and from ministers of churches who would essentially, complain about efforts to talk to folks of color in their churches. There were maybe sort of two camps of complaints. One was, you're agitating folks of color in the church, and you're, and they're getting upset, or they're, getting angry, at white folks about racism. And then the other set of complaints was sort of, coded language around, well, these are our folks, you shouldn't be talking to them, there's no issues in our churches, and so there's no need to, invite them into community as folks of color. So sort of the love, see no color kind of argument. And these, were issues for many of our both young folks who were trying to connect with other young folks of color as volunteers, as well as folks at the UUA who were on staff, who were trying to sort of support these new efforts around people of color organizing. Next slide. So this is when, very quickly within 2 years, Drum expanded to sort of see that there needed to be a space for folks of color in general, and really created an umbrella sort of structure, or like a hub, where there definitely were caucuses for professionals of color still, there were caucuses for youth, but there was sort of a larger center hub that allowed sort of folks of color to sort of coordinate and communicate together. And Jim Brown, who was a lay leader, became our third Drum president. Next slide. Drum seminarians were also formed in 2002. And I'll just note again from a personal story, when I was a seminarian at Harvard Divinity School in the early 2000s, there were as many seminarians of color during that time as there were settled ministers of color who were still active in the faith. There were about 30 of us in seminaries across the country, and 30 folks or less in congregations or in chaplaincies. So we have really seen, since the early 2000s, and partly I think as a result of all the organizing happening around community building in the 80s and 90s, a new generation of folks of color seeing ministry as a path and seeing the faith as a home where they can, live into their call to ministry. Next slide. This is about the Youth and Young Adults, or YAYA Leadership School. We held the first one in San Diego with a lot of support from the church there. That also has one of the oldest drum chapters in the country. Next slide. In 2002, an Asian Pacific Islander caucus was founded, and that caucus continues to this day. There's about maybe 150 folks around the country who are connected. Next slide. Soul Work, one of sort of our, I think, really key texts around our Unitarian Universalist theologies of race and racism, was published. The Reverend Marjorie Bones Wheatley was the primary editor and sort of convener of many of these stories, and it includes both white and folks of color and UUs and non-UUs who came together for a symposium. It's really quite a wonderful collection. I encourage folks to really, take time to consider reading this one. Next slide. So again, another incident, and these are going to sound familiar. We had a group of youth of color who were essentially kicked out of GA for not wearing their name tags, and the security didn't think that they were UUs because they were Black or brown. And this turned into a whole nother incident where the UUA's Board of Trustees formed a task force, did a bunch of study and research, and recommended a lot of policy changes. But it's again one of those experiences of the escalation of racism within our church. Next slide. So in 2007, Finding Our Way Home was formed, and this is the annual now annual retreat for professionals of color in our association. And in the early retreats, we had 30, maybe 40 folks attend. In the retreat that happened in 2019, we had over 125 folks come from around the country. So it's been really incredible to see some of the racial cultural diversity now within all of our religious professional ranks, from administrators and DREs and ministers and music directors. So And I think that this also means that there's a deepening and an institutionalization of a lot of the sort of deeper shared vision around a racially just association. Next slide. So in 2008 was the first year that the UUA hired staff specific to serving folks of color. And again, just a comparison, almost every other denomination in the US have really deep ministries with folks of color, with staff at the national level who provide resources and support and coordination. But for us, it wasn't until 2008 when that sort of vision began to emerge at the UUA, and the first staff were serving youth and young adults of color. So next slide. Another great text, The Arc of the Universe, is published that documented the journey from Calgary, which is when the Racial Cultural Diversity Resolution was passed at the GA in Calgary in '93, all the way through to the journey towards wholeness and beyond. And some of these stories that I'm sharing, or these slides, are drawn from this, really this encyclopedia and this, deeper telling of the stories of all the efforts around anti-racism and many of the struggles and challenges. Next slide. In 2010, the UUA went a different direction and decided that it was no longer going to partner with many of its affiliate organizations, and essentially reset and devolved its entire anti-racism program. It divested in Drum. It broke its relationship with Crossroads Ministry. And in some ways, I would say, the UUA went into sort of a wilderness space when it came to race and racism again, and really, sort of said, do whatever you want, but we're not really going to have sort of a national strategy anymore. And part of that, I think, was the result of a lot of the concerns and critiques, especially from white ministers. At the time, the UU ministers, the UUMA, which I'm a member of, the UU Ministers Association, was very conflicted around anti-racism work, and there was a lot of struggle around sort of the role that white ministers played in our churches and their resistance to really bringing forward sort of race and racism into the conversations, and seeing the ministry that folks of color needed. That has changed substantially now, where in many ways the UUMA has become a leader around really a deep practice of anti-racism, anti-oppression. Next slide. Another sort of resource book. This was self-published by a group of UUs of color in 2015. They sought to have it published by our UU press called Beacon Press or Skinner House, but they were turned away. So they went ahead and self-published and made it available both in print and online. Next slide. So we're getting to the end. So in 2015, Black Lives of UU was founded, and this probably deserves its entirely own sort of session, because what they've created and the movement that they have sort of pushed forward is truly remarkable, deeply needed, and Blue and Drum work in close partnership together, and have, since the beginning. We've had many crossover members, and it's been really wonderful to see just the depth and the breadth of Blue's ministry, where they think, and have been offering, programs from the pastoral to the prophetic that are centering Black UUs. And they also offer a lot of activities and programs that connect with the wider community, and that are open to all folks. But they've really been deepening, and I think really pushing the envelope, or really expanding our vision of what is possible of having more deeper both and ministries that are culturally specific. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. Drum in 2016, after 6 years of sort of being disconnected from the UUA in many ways, issued a call for renewal. And this was right around the time of the crisis when Peter Morales, our UUA president, had resigned due to, again, a range of sort of racism sort of allegations at the UUA. Drum issued a public statement supporting the jury truthfulness process and, cautioning against the backsliding that has been happening in the 20th year of the General Assembly resolution. Next slide, and we're almost to the end. So in 2016, the UUA pledged $5.3 million to support Black Lives of UU. And as if you follow them on social media or on their website, they've been very transparent about all the work they're doing, and they've created an incredible leadership team, and they have a small staff that is sort of building out programs. And that, was really intended to be the fulfillment of the broken promises from the 1960s and provide sort of a foundation for this ministry into the future. Next slide, please. In 2017, partly as a result of the resignation of Peter Morales and a number of other high-profile UUs, the UUA again created a task force, the Commission on Institutional Change, to really analyze white supremacy and racism within the institution. Leslie Takahashi, a former Drum president, is named chair, and the report was issued earlier this year and is now available, the Commission on Institutional Change report. Pretty substantial report again, hundreds of pages of transcripts and interviews and analysis, and something that is worth, I think, a deeper dive. Next slide. In 2017, Drum, which had really been struggling in the 2010s, in part because a lack of resources and sort of an inability to really connect together because the natural places of connection were being defunded. Drum launched a small project that really was part of our own renewal as an organization. The Reverend Marisol Caballero and several others envisioned a global majorities project where they were inviting UUs of color to create innovative, multicultural art, music, worship, liturgy programs. And they worked with about 20 folks in 2017, 2018, and were able to give them small grants to create some sort of new ideas and some new innovations. And this also began to sort of rekindle connections with both the new and the old generations of Drum. The next slide. In 2019, Drum began to do a deeper sort of community scan and reached out to every congregation in the UUA to learn more about if they have any local people of color ministries or people of color groups. We knew of maybe 5 or 6 before we started this sort of survey. And by the end, we identified over 40 around the country. And that was actually a surprise to many of us in Drum. And almost all the groups didn't know other groups existed. And so we've now since begun to form a network amongst these groups and are thinking about how to provide resources and support to the facilitators and organizers of these local people of color ministries in our congregations. I'm going to go to the next slide. It might be almost the end. In 2019, Drum and the UUA recovenanted, and what that meant was there's a more formal connection and relationship again between the leadership of the organizations, and the UUA has also partnered with Drum to raise about $20,000 to $30,000 a year to help support the operations of Drum. The rest of our funds, which are fairly modest, come from our Drum membership dues and donations from the Allies for Racial Equity. Next slide. Okay, so I just have two sort of last points to make. One is that we have done a survey with UUs of color in 2019 to really sort of ask folks, what is it that we should be focusing on as an organization going forward? And overwhelmingly, folks are seeking these kinds of experiences to connect with other folks of color, other BIPOC UUs, both in community, and in spirituality, and in worship and liturgy. And folks are looking, and the kind of feedback we've heard was looking to sort of balance that with their larger UU congregational experiences, really a both and approach, and looking for more culturally competent pastoral care, from our sort of professionals of color and professionals in general. The next slide. And so, Drum has been thinking about ways to build and create more space that, folks want to see more Drum spaces. And so we've been hosting, during the time of the COVID pandemic, more virtual gatherings. But also we're looking at how to expand our Drum chaplaincy network. We're wanting to sort of offer more leadership development programs, and of course continue to work with congregations in the UUA around anti-racism and justice-making work. So this really comes to the end. Next slide. Thanks so much, Mateo, for helping run this. This was really a quick and dirty overview of a timeline exercise that we tend to do as sort of a half-day workshop. But hopefully it gives you just some new insights into some of the stories and histories that have been a part of our people of color communities for many years. And I think for both folks of color and for white folks, it's important that we know some of these stories because it sometimes can become something that can like be a big elephant in the room that no one really knows about. But that some people do. And so, and especially it can maybe speak to also the state of mind for a lot of our leaders of color in the church. Sometimes when folks get stressed or sort of worn out and feeling like this has become, a very sort of challenging cycle, it's, I think, good to move back sometimes and look at the larger picture. It's really wonderful to be able to share some of these, really, really small pieces of our history with folks here. And, would love to really hear the questions and conversations or just comments and analysis from BIPOC folks for the second part of this session. So thank you very much. Blessings.